so delighted to have Rick Tarnas and Matt Segall tonight to talk on the topic of Gimme Shelter, Weathering the Storm in an Archetypal Cosmos. Sounds juicy, huh? I'm not gonna race through the introduction, but I'm really eager to get to what you guys have to say. This weather report that we're all eager to hear about. Rick is the founding director of the graduate program here in philosophy, cosmology, and consciousness. He teaches courses in cultural history, archetypal studies, depth psychology, history of philosophy, and religious evolution. He's the author of The Passion of the Western Mind, a history of the Western worldview from the ancient Greek to the postmodern, widely used in universities, including CIIS. His second book, Cosmos and Psyche, Intimations of a New Worldview, received the Book of the Year prize from the Scientific and Medical Network and is the basis for the upcoming documentary film, Changing of the Gods. When is that due?
Next year.
Next year. He's a past president of the International Transpersonal Association and served for many years on the board of governors for the C.G. Jung Institute of San Francisco. And Matt Segall teaches in the Philosophy, Cosmology, and Consciousness program here at CIIS. He's the author of Physics of the World Soul, The Relevance of Alfred North Whitehead's Philosophy of Organism to Contemporary Scientific Cosmology. He's also the author of The Reemergence of Schelling, Philosophy in a Time of Emergency, and several other books and essays on a variety of topics ranging from economics and ecology to transpersonal psychology, psychedelics, and religious studies. He's also the manager of the Provost's office here at CIIS, so he's a busy guy. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to you guys. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you, Richard, and Cynthia and the alumni office for making this event possible tonight, and thanks for everyone for turning out tonight. And the tickets you purchased will help people attend CIIS, students attend CIIS in the future. So thank you very much for coming here and making that contribution. I'm very excited to be in conversation with Rick tonight. I know, with recent events that I am really desperately searching for some sense of orientation in a very chaotic time. And, we can look at our current situation socially, politically, ecologically, etc., from a variety of perspectives. And I think tonight we're going to try to zoom out in a sense and look at what's happening among human beings, I think particularly in our country, but around the world as well, and look at recent events from a cosmological perspective and a depth psychological or archetypal perspective to try to find out what the heck is going on. Over the last year, I know I'm probably not alone in feeling a deep sense of confusion and surprise and being caught off guard by, the election and so on. So we have a brilliant astrologer and cultural historian with us tonight who's going to help give us a sense of archetypal orientation, drawing on the archetypal cosmological perspective and seeing what the planets might have to tell us about what we're going through and what we might expect in the near future. So Rick, can you give us an archetypal weather report to help orient us? We need some shelter. I know, it's not all good news about the recent or the near future. We've got hold on to your hats because it's not over yet. But help give us a sense for the archetypal meaning that's pervading our society at the moment, and give us some perspective on what's going on here.
Thanks, Matt and Richard, and thanks all of you for coming, supporting the Alumni Scholarship Fund, and just for your interest and engagement with this big. Well, all of us are engaged, whether we want to or not, with this moment in history. But your interest in getting a perspective that calls upon our knowledge of the great archetypal forces, a kind of depth perspective on what's happening. You know, Jung spoke about how important it is to differentiate and, in a sense, name the powers, the energies that are at work in the psyche, in the collective unconscious, as well as in our individual lives. And there's something about that act of differentiation, of naming, that is very helpful in itself. It helps the unconscious be conscious. It gives us more capacity to be skillful individuals living our lives in a complex world. But at the same time, there's the astrological perspective, the fact that these archetypal energies that are at work at any given era in the collective psyche, as evidenced in the major historical events of each time, each decade, and so forth. The fact that these correlate so consistently and with such nuance and precision with planetary cycles in our solar system is an amazing gift, in a sense, and I think of it as a gift from the cosmos. It helps orient us. It gives us a cosmic, an ensouled cosmic context within which to navigate, to surf the waves. So, and there's something healing about just connecting to that level of cosmic meaning and larger cycles and so forth. We're not just in a kind of random, isolated, meaningless crisis. It's part of something much bigger. So, in all these respects, that's in the background. And just now to go to the big planetary alignments of our time. The biggest one that is kind of running the show in a certain way is the Uranus-Pluto square, the alignment between the planet Pluto, the planet Uranus, planetoid, dwarf planet Pluto. Didn't seem to make any difference to the god behind Pluto. Our astronomical status report. But we have just come in this last decade to the first dynamic alignment of these two planets since the 1960s and early 70s. That was the last time they were in conjunction. So they were in conjunction from approximately 1960 to 1972. And they moved into the square just before Obama's election here in the U.S. In 2007 is when they moved within about 10 degrees of exact alignment. And then this will go through about 2020. So those are and I'm giving those time spans because having studied with many others the historical record, tracking carefully how long a particular planetary alignment seems to be, let's call it archetypally operative. They use the word orbs in astrology. How long, how far away from exact does it have to be to be visible in human affairs? And it looks like pretty consistently for all the outer planetary alignments, Jupiter on out, that there's about a 15-degree orb for the conjunctions and the oppositions, which would be like the new moon and the full moon. Like the new moon is a conjunction of the sun and moon. The full moon, of course, is the opposition. And if when you look at the new moon, or you look, when you don't see the moon during the new moon, or when you do see the full moon, there's about a 15-degree range on each side of the exact full moon, let's say, where the moon looks full. So we see it full a couple nights each month. And that seems to be the perfectly parallel to, or kind of visible metaphor for how long these activations of the archetypal energies that seem to be, as it were, cosmically connected to, associated with these planets. And maybe I'll just say one last thing. I know a lot of you people know here tonight have a good sense for the the overall perspective here, the idea of that these seem to be more like synchronistic relationships between the planetary movements and the archetypal activations, the wave of energies that come into our lives in coincidence with these planetary movements. I don't think that it's explicable, certainly not in any straightforward physicalistic linear causal way, like electromagnetic rays or something. It doesn't, there's too many problems with understanding it that way. It seems to be much more of a kind of synchronistic relationship that could be, I always like to refer to the great passage from the Neoplatonist philosopher Plotinus, who said everything in the world is interconnected. As has been said, all things breathe together. And I think that perfectly captures the way in which, let's say, the soul of our human collective psyche is breathing together with the soul of the macrocosm, of the cosmos, the anima mundi. So that's the basic, ontology behind this. So Uranus and Pluto. Uranus, discovered in 1781, within the next century and a half, through careful attention, it was given the meaning. It was recognized to be coinciding with with an energy that relates to change, to sudden change, to the unpredictable, a kind of trickster energy, but also to like the flash of insight, the sudden breakthrough, the feeling of having a lightning flash of insight, the awakening. There's also a connection to freedom, to rebellion, to the impulse to overthrow existing structures, the status quo, etc. All these characteristics seem to very much relate to the Prometheus myth in Greece, though it takes different forms in other cultures. Sorry, I just had a dental intervention here the other day. That's my Saturn transit of the season. Pluto, just to finish what I was saying about the Prometheus archetype. It's that basic archetypal principle of freedom, rebellion, change, originality, breakthrough, restless impulse for exciting emancipation from the previous structures, breaking through into new territory, but also a kind of chaotic impulse as well, irresponsible at times, that kind of thing. And on the other hand, you have the Plutonic, which seems to relate to the very principle of power and transformation in ways that can be both destructive and creative and regenerative. And it has a lot to do with what Freud called the id, the underworld of the instincts in the psyche and the body. It relates to Hades in that sense, but also Dionysus. There's the sexual energies, the erotic life energies. It's what drives the Darwinian evolutionary process, the Schopenhauerian will, the will to power in Nietzsche's sense. And it, at a very deep level, it relates to mythic and spiritual beings and symbols such as Kali, the Kundalini force, the serpent energy. It is the Ouroboros that is feeding on itself and dying and being reborn in its own continual regenerative activity. So all that's in there. And you bring these two together, and every time they come into conjunction or opposition or square, what's called the quadrature alignments, you get a period of a little more than a decade or so that is really cooking. Social, political turmoil, rebellion, revolution, highly creative times is often, a lot of technological advance at a very accelerated pace, scientific breakthroughs, et cetera, but also this quality of the social political turmoil, and also a kind of activation of deep, powerful energies that can be destructive, that can be violent, and rebellions and revolutions can begin as reform, as idealistic, and then move into more violent forms, which we saw often in the 60s. We saw it in the Arab Spring, and in our own presidential election, where in a sense we could say there were three candidates, all of whom represented different inflections of this combination. They were all change agents. I'm talking about Bernie Sanders, Hillary Clinton, and Trump. And each one represented a different form of this impulse for profound change, rebellion against the status quo, but also frequently with a quality of, I'll say in a couple minutes something about the relationship to other eras, but the last time we had it was in the 60s, and you can see how our first president during this current alignment, Barack Obama, very much represented something, an impulse that was at work in the 1960s, namely the Civil Rights Movement. And in the same way, you had the situation with Bernie Sanders, who is carrying, the very idealistic calls for social reform, social justice, economic justice, and which as well was a major part of 1960s social movements and philosophies. And in the case of Hillary Clinton, she's carrying another one of the great social movements from the 1960s, of course, the women's movement and feminism. And And then what do you say about Trump? In many ways, on the one hand, you can see this as an example of, I mean, he is a trickster, he is a disruptor, he is an agent of change. But here you see another side of how these planets work together, or how the archetypes work together, and that is that Pluto is not just empowering and driving the Uranus Promethean principle of change, rebellion, freedom, reform, disruption, and so forth, technological breakthrough. It's not only doing that, it goes the other way around too. Uranus is awakening and liberating the Plutonic, which would be like the deep id forces in the collective psyche, among other things. Think of, I mean, there's a certain way in which Hades kind of erupted out of the depths and abducted Persephone, the soul of America, in a sense, and pulled it down into the depths, into an underworld of raw instinctual energies. Pluto can, I mean, there's very high levels of plutonic expression, which we can get to, but it also can be extremely, it can reflect a very primitive psychology, kind of reptilian, you could say, and no disrespect meant to the reptiles. But that quality of the Hades abduction is something that's very tangible. I think day after day, many people are experiencing sorry, I need a new cementing job here.
The Plutonic thing would be to just pull it out and put it on the table.
Yeah, right. I might lisp then. All dignity will be thrown to the winds. Yeah. I knew when we agreed to do it on this night, I thought, well, something's going to happen. But the whole idea here is that these archetypal forces are multivalent. All archetypes have the full range from the most noble to the most ignoble potential, the most creative, life-enhancing to quite shadow potentials. And there's nothing preordained about the archetypal complex going one direction or another. It tends to go both under hard aspects. And they can trigger each other too. For example, think about how much the impulses for countercultural impulses for reform and rebellion and bringing new, like let's say, social justice movements, immigration rights, Black Lives Matter, women's empowerment. What's that?
Standing Rock.
Standing Rock, exactly. All these, how a sense of disruption of the status quo can actually trigger a will to power that attempts to suppress that rebellion or that threat to power that is already lodged into the social and political and economic structures. And so you get, 1968, at the peak of the 60s, you get Richard Nixon being elected president, very much in such a moment of social political turmoil and disruption and threat to the status quo. Those of you who were here in California 50 years ago will remember that Ronald Reagan was elected governor not least because Berkeley and San Francisco and the Bay Area were erupting with a free speech movement and anti-war students, and of course Black Power and so forth. And so I'm trying to give a sense for how these different archetypal forces can constellate in ways that go in a multitude, a multivalent range of ways. And it very much depends on human consciousness and our level of consciousness and our moral fiber as to how things go, as to how we enact the energies that are there in a more as Jorge Ferrer would put it, the energies there are multivalent and indeterminate, and are being enacted by human beings, and in that sense, it's a kind of moral responsibility that we all have in how we enact those. And the advantage of the archetypal perspective is it helps us be more mindful of what energies are being activated at what time, how it's hitting our personal charts, for example, and it can give us a greater consciousness for dealing with surfing these powerful waves. That's a start anyway. It gives just a little bit of an overview of this very powerful Uranus-Pluto energy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we really saw the multivalence of that archetypal combination with, coming into alignment in 2008, just as Obama is elected president, and he serves 2 terms, 8 years, and then, after Obama, we get Donald Trump, and it seems that the other side, the polar opposite potential of the Uranus-Pluto is brought to the fore with Trump's rise to power, and the way that the reaction to the revolutionary energy that Obama carried with him has just taken power now, where we have the first African American elected president, and then the deep-seated racism that is woven into the fabric of the United States of America is sort of brought back to the surface. It had gone into hiding a little bit. It's always there, but it's like a black man being elected president brought this backlash.
Exactly.
And now we have to deal with that.
Yeah.
The shadow has been brought into the light, in a sense.
Yeah, which in some sense is a potential, healing crisis, you could say, on a national level. It has that potential, but it also can be just, catastrophic as well. Maybe I should point out that we're in the square right now, which has its own kind of destabilizing nature. It's kind of like going through the intersection, and you can't. The 90-degree angle is a particularly. It tends to make things happen with a great deal of often disorienting or jarring force. In addition, if we look at when's the last time these were square, it was the 1930s. It was 1928 to 37 approximately.
You're not helping, Rick.
Well, so here now we have let's take a look at how the 60s carried both sides. I think in the CIIS community easily have a pretty positive view of the 60s for lots of good reasons. But it also carried pretty much everything, the will to power, violent revolution, the as Gene Houston once put it, the demonstrators screaming peace through the venom coming out of their teeth. But you also had you had a kind of what happened in China, for example, under Mao, with the Cultural Revolution. Just incredible amount of violence. Vietnam, and Indonesia, and 120 cities burned in the United States in the summer of '67, 50 years ago. As part, like I was in Detroit at that time, so places like Detroit, Watts, L.A., Newark, many other, just tremendous eruption of energy. And if we look at the 30s, yes, you get that eruption of mob energy, the fascism, the will to power, but you also get this is the time of the New Deal. This is the time of many, a lot of social reform, politically, economically, was happening throughout the world, and so you had FDR in the 30s, you had Kennedy and Johnson with the Great Society, the New Frontier in the 60s. You had Obama in the 2007 to 2020 period, who are carrying that more reform, social justice impulse. So I want to balance, and you think of the music of the 60s, which was such a terrific source of and vessel of creativity and liberation and even empowering it, the impulses for social reform. I heard civil rights pioneers in the 1960s describe how important music was to them. They would sing 2 hours of music for every hour of political meetings that they would have in preparations for their different, going to Selma or going to on the Freedom Ride. Anyway, the music is so important, and the dancing, et cetera. And if you go back to the 1930s, if you look at what was happening then with jazz, the nation was on fire with a Dionysian eruption of energy that was very exciting and liberating. It also brought, it also made major incursions on racial segregation, having black and white audiences together, musicians together. It was African American music to in the main that was just transforming the collective psyche, first of America, and then out into the world. That's all from the 30s. Mm-hmm. So I want to try to give that balance, to try to remember we've got more going on than just the first image that we might get.
Sure, right. Mm. So Uranus, Pluto, obviously in the last several years, going back to 2008, has been this major archetypal force helping to shape human events. We've got a few more years left of that. But in 2019 or so, there's another archetypal planetary alignment that's coming into orb, Saturn and Pluto, which, as I mentioned in the introduction, it's not necessarily good news, though there's multivalence, as we've been discussing. And so, can you give us a sense for the light and the shadow of this next archetypal complex, bringing as Uranus moves out of alignment with Pluto, Saturn comes into alignment with Pluto, and what can we expect from that?
Well, the Uranus square Pluto is going to be fully operative during that whole Saturn transit.
Okay.
And as a matter of fact, one of the things you see with world transits like these is that they tend to, the archetypal complex kind of saturates the collective psyche with increasing permeation of the whole, so that in the later stages of the alignment, it has the it actually seems more powerful than in the earlier stages, or even when it's exact. It's more powerful later, and and when it's for example, in many ways, what we think of as the 60s was very present into the early 70s, and was in some ways more potently being actualized after exact, which was in 1966, than before or during. It's like so many things have been set into motion that it cascades, and there's a kind of recursive feedback loop of increasing strength of the archetype. So I think that energy is going to be with us, for good or ill, for some time. It's like the unpredictable, the exciting, the dramatic, the potential for things going a lot of different ways is all there. But what Saturn brings in is the reality principle in a kind of potent way when it comes in with Pluto, and it can be a time when one needs to face the consequences of the kinds of actions that have taken place prior to that, and it's when the bill has to be paid. It's when I mean, the last time we had Saturn come into alignment with this Uranus-Pluto was right at the beginning of this one, and that was the first T-square, as it's called, of Saturn, Uranus, and Pluto since the 1929 to 33 T-square, which was the last time that there was a global financial collapse. And the one before that, by the way, the only other time in the last 200 years that those three planets came into the T-square was 1873 to 76, which was the other major, what's called the Long Depression, precedent to the Great Depression of the 30s and our own global financial collapse or crisis in the 10 years ago up to, well, certainly 2008 to 2011.
So in the last 200 years, we're having two of these T-squares within the span of 15 years or so.
Yeah, that's right.
Or less than that, yeah.
Well,
10 years.
Well, T-square, we've done it just once then, 2008 to 11 was when it was closest. But now we're coming into Saturn conjoining Pluto, squaring Uranus. So it's not a T-square, but it's a similar energy.
Right.
When I saw that Trump could become president, I thought, oh man, I could see, besides just all the negatives, do you see the picture of him with the Pope? That you could see the Pope looked very, very uncomfortable. And I was thinking about it later, that Trump carries so much he's kind of like a vivid embodiment of the seven cardinal sins, I mean, think about it. Greed, lust, vanity, gluttony, sloth, envy. I mean, it's all there. And, I mean, I can imagine the Pope, I mean, it looks like he's trying to get as far away in the picture as possible. Anyway, it was a kind of archetypal moment. But when I saw that the possibility of him becoming president, and I was looking at his transits, man, he's got some really rough transits coming up personally. And the danger of him becoming president is that he carries us all into that, the paranoid ideation, the sense of things going wrong, etc. His reactivity. Maybe I'll just say one quick thing too about the fact that the United States is going through its Pluto return. Right now, Pluto's opposite its sun pretty tightly. This is a very, this is the first Pluto return and Pluto opposite sun since it was born, since the United States came into being. So we're getting a very kind of collective, personal eruption of the Plutonic and of a deep death and potential rebirth for the national psyche in a certain way. And we're certain. I mean, has there been any time prior in our history when our shadow has been more visible? I mean, that's the thing about Trump, is that he doesn't so much. He didn't start the catastrophe that we already knew we were going to be facing at this time. Even if Hillary Clinton or Bernie Sanders were president right now, the world is in a catastrophic environmental situation, and the forces that are at work there would still be there. But he definitely exaggerates and hastens the crisis and the catastrophic potential. And he also has this quality of carrying, how should I put it? He has the potential of exemplifying for us our tendency, the shadow that was already at work in humanity's relationship to the Earth community. Because everything that he does, the objectification of others, the impulse to use, to make others into an it rather than a thou, the exploitative attitude, that's so central to how our civilization has been acting towards the rest of the Earth community for a long time. And he embodies that, but he also embodies it as to how human beings relate to each other, and objectifying each other, using each other, turning everybody into a means for one's own self-enhancement, whether as a species or as a nation or as an individual. Yeah. And so in some ways he's a kind of morality tale for the collective to face its own self in the mirror.
I couldn't imagine a better sort of poster child for the American id than Donald Trump, and so he almost seems more like a symptom of what the presidency has become. I think Obama was a reprieve from that, but it's to the point with Trump now that liberals are looking back to the days of George Bush and wishing that he was still our president.
Yeah, that's hard to imagine.
Yeah, so he does seem more like an embodiment of the American id, sort of summing up everything that we feel a sense of guilt about as progressives, that we don't like to look at in our country's history, and the way that we treat the Earth community, the way people of color are treated, and
Native Americans.
It's like, at least with Bush, there was some attempt made to pretend like he had the interests of a more humane vision in
Right.
mind.
Yeah, it's a good point.
There's no attempt made to hide that Trump wants to empower the oil companies and he wants to empower white men to take back their country, and it's just right on the surface now.
Yeah, yeah. The only subterfuge is his ability to somehow pull the wool over the eyes of a large segment of the electorate that he was about to rip off,
Right.
that voted for him.
Yeah.
That's somehow wasn't sufficiently on the surface for those people.
He spoke the populist language, that kind of Uranus Pluto rhetoric that made people think he was, going to bring change to Washington and drain the swamp and empower, the working class and so on. So he was speaking the sort of Bernie Sanders language. But as soon as he got into power, it was clear that he was another oligarch that was going to empower corporations.
Yeah. I think you could say that with Saturn coming into the conjunction with Pluto, this begins it starts really in early next year, that it comes within 15 degrees of the conjunction to Pluto. And then it will go on for about 3 to 4 years. And it's a period usually of a great deal of, it's a very serious period. It's a period of gravitas. It tends to forge moral structures, courage, but it also tends to require those. Before I knew that Trump would be president, I assumed that we would be looking at both a financial and above all an ecological crisis, where things would happen that made it clear how attitudes or actions of excess, of irresponsibility, of greed, or just the fact that our technological industrial civilization has gone for so long mindlessly unmindful of the consequences to the larger Earth community and to the ocean, to the climate. That's why one of the reasons I use the phrase "gimme shelter," because it's the Plutonic is also the deep elemental powers of the Earth and of the volcano, the earthquake, the hurricane, the heat, the fire. Look at all the fires happening, literally, and the fires within cities, as well as fires and explosions of trains and so forth, but also the fires of our overheated dry forests and so forth. So my sense is that this next period is a kind of initiatory eye of the needle for our civilization that could be very helpful in the long run because of its making clear the what's at stake. And I mean, even though it's been clear to a lot of us for a long time, I think it's likely to become more clear to more people during these next several years.
So we've kind of started with the application of archetypal cosmology, looking at our national situation. I wonder if in the last 10 or 15 minutes here we might
Before we open up to this, questions and
discussion,
stuff.
yeah.
Right.
If we might discuss sort of the cosmological and metaphysical implications of these types of correlations. Like, what does it mean about the universe that we live in that we can track planetary transits and correlate them with shifting human events? It isn't something that modern people are usually willing to consider. Since the scientific revolution, we have come to view the universe sort of as the background to human events, and meaning and purpose are exclusively human. And what the archetypal cosmological worldview seems to call us to attend to is the way in which human meaning is informed by cosmological meaning, and in some sense human meaning may even be derivative of cosmological meaning.
Right. Or in a feedback loop with it, so that
Right.
because we are the cosmos too.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. One of the cosmos's many creative, intelligent beings who
Yeah.
are participating in this evolutionary journey. So, given everything that's happening politically, socially, and ecologically, it seems like we're being given the opportunity to recognize the way in which modern civilization has neglected its ground and its origins.
No, I think you put it very well. I mean, there's so many reasons why so much went into the disenchantment of the universe. So many factors: religious, philosophical, psychological, even social and political. We study those kinds of things in PCC all the time, and it's all the complexity of worldview transformation is a marvelous study. But given our disenchanted mainstream modern cosmology, the archetypal cosmological point of view and the possibility that astrology might have validity is a real either, well, it pushes the paradigm boundary line further than into an actualization of a cosmic anima mundi and the existence of an intelligence at work in the cosmos that is somehow focused on this moving Earth, and even on individuals. It's not. So it makes the Earth, which had been so radically decentered by the Copernican revolution and the Darwinian revolution and Freud and all the different ways in which we have been decentered, and it suddenly reveals that in some way, while we are not the only center, but we seem to be a center of a focus of cosmic meaning, that the planets in their movements would bear such close correlation, that there'd be such an orchestration between above and below, between the cosmos and the human being's experience. It points to the fact that in some ways the universe seems to care about the Earth, and even about the individual human being. Now, this is a feeling that as individuals we often get in our spiritual journeys, that, after there's a dark night of the soul that seems to be pretty regular feature of our spiritual journeys, and there is a discovery through grace, through the dying into life and all the different ways it can unexpectedly come, in which one feels that one is somehow one is participating in something larger that cares about how your life or my life is unfolding. And that experience of the individual seems to be something also that can be visible on the collective level, and that the astrological evidence points to this this larger kind of intelligence, creative intelligence at work in the cosmos of inconceivable sophistication and creativity and power that also has a moral dimension to it and an aesthetic dimension to it, so that moral values and aesthetic values are not just human constructs, but seem to be grounded in the very nature of the cosmos. And the cosmos seems to be waiting there for us to kind of catch up to it, rather than us being the only conscious intelligence in the universe. It's a rather different situation. And so my sense is that we are, as a species and as a civilization, in an initiatory crisis, a rite of passage, as it were, into perhaps a kind of cosmic discovering our relationship to the larger cosmic community, instead of being this isolated, inflated nutcase. And having the archetypal cosmological perspective as a kind of matrix, in the same way that we all need each other in our communities, and particularly at times like this, where I think we need like heroic communities that are, by heroic I mean have an allegiance to a vision of the good that is different than the mainstream cultures, and that it takes a kind of heroic allegiance to be able to hold that. The prophets had it. Socrates had it in Athens. The sages in China, like Lao Tzu, etc. There's a heroic quality to their allegiance to a higher good that is not being carried by the collective. But in our day, we need individuals will not be able to engage in the act of sustained intellectual and imaginative and moral commitment to be able to transform our worldview. We can't do it as individuals. It takes heroic communities like CIIS or Pioneers or Jungian communities or astrological communities or Damanhur or Findhorn and so forth. And to be able to pull this off, and it involves also holding space as a community for the individuals in them to individuate and go through the spiritual journey and the descents and the suffering and the falling apart and the coming together again and the being reborn that happens in these journeys. We need to do that for each other in communities. But what I'm suggesting is that the collective psyche of humanity, as impelled by the modern mind, has managed to kind of disengage the human being from the rest of the tribal community of life itself, not just the immediate local tribe, as in an initiation in a Navajo or an Aboriginal tribal context, but we've done it we have separated ourselves from the entire community of the anima mundi, of the ensouled cosmos, and are going through all the classic signs of an initiation, like of a rite of passage, like the crisis of meaning, the deconstruction of our sense of our identity, the encounter with mortality, only on a planetary scale now. The sense even of going through a kind of madness. That's very typical of an initiatory crisis, where your sense of reality is really losing a clear stability. And in all these ways, it seems to me that we are going through a collective rite of passage, and the archetypal cosmos is in some sense providing for us a kind of crucially helpful matrix of not only helping to give us a sense. I've only mentioned the Uranus-Pluto alignment and a little bit about Saturn too, but there's several other things going on as well, like the Saturn square Neptune of that we're moving towards the end of, that has so much to do with fake news and the deception versus and seeing through deception and spin and propaganda and so forth. It also has a lot to do with watery crises, droughts and floods, and anyway, we've had this for the last 3-4 years.
Dissolution of trust in institutions. And
Yes, very much a disillusionment, yeah, and also tendency for it tends to coincide with periods of a lot of psychopathology. Very good period for psychotherapists. With addiction, drug addiction crises, opioid epidemic, but in the past it's been things like the crack cocaine epidemic or the heroin addiction epidemic of the early 70s, et cetera. Anyway, I was working in the Haight-Ashbury drug clinic in the early 70s, and I remember how clearly it went from the psychedelic use to how many people were using heroin at that point under the Saturn opposite Neptune. Anyway, I'm just giving a little suggestion of the fact that there's all the planets are doing things right now, and I just focused on the big that combination of give me shelter and street fighting man and a bit of sympathy for the devil. Pleased to meet you. You know, I'm a man of wealth and taste. I don't know about the taste, but that you could just take each of those Stone songs from 68 and 69 and open a lens on my name is called disturbance. I shout and scream, I kill the king, I rail at all his servants, and the storm is threatening, even the environmental storm, etc. So the archetypal cosmos not only provides us with kind of a weather report, a capacity to have a sense for which way the winds are blowing and when and where and for how long, etc., but and how we could perhaps bring about more life-enhancing rather than destructive expressions of those archetypal complexes. But in addition, in the same way that we as a community can hold space for each other to go through a deep transformation, so too can the cosmos, as Chad Harris said once, it's like the cosmos itself is holding space for us to go through this transformation. It provides us with a larger order that is open to our inflection, our how we act in our freedom plays a crucial role in what unfolds from it. But the musical chords are there. What melodies we sing to it and how we dance to it is up to us. And so there's a way, I think, in which archetypal cosmology, or the archetypal cosmos, let's say, offers a kind of a centering, orienting, healing matrix within which we can go through this transformation. And those of us who have, both through the grace of perhaps having had a kind of spiritual opening in our own lives, in whatever forms it may have taken, combined with this larger sense of a trust in the cosmos itself, can give us the possibility of a certain spiritual centeredness, a balance, even a kind of peacefulness in the eye of the storm, kind of, that may be very, very important as we go through what undoubtedly is going to be some fairly dramatic times to come. I mean, perhaps in these next immediate 3-4 years. But we all know, I mean, what's the longer term has a tremendous drama we all have in front of us this lifetime. And it's going to take everything that we can bring to meet the challenges of it. And it's a privilege, in a sense, to be here, all of us on this earth at this time, to, I think, bring our best to this moment. But in response to your question, Matt, I think there is something not only immediately kind of instrumentally helpful in knowing what transits are happening when, but there's something even more spiritually grounding and centering and healing, nourishing to having this, by having this perspective and this sense of the universe's care and intelligence that we are participating in, and that our moving Earth is like dancing in this enormously complex harmony of the spheres, kind of divine music that we can hardly glimpse, but can be deeply inspired by.
Right. Just the sense that amidst the chaos that may be, we might feel like we're drowning in, there's still an order at work. And that chaos itself has an archetypal timing to it.
Yeah.
And that, even when all seems lost, it's still just a season. And it will pass. And amidst chaos, there's an order sort of that's hiding beneath the surface that eventually will show itself.
Yeah, and it's both a season in the sense like this too will pass, and it's also a season in the sense that this season is crucial. The season is necessary. There's certain types of chaos that are crucial for the birth of a star.
Yeah.
To what Nietzsche's great sentence about one must have chaos in one's soul if one is to give birth to a star.
Mm-hmm.
How true that is also in a time like this where the Uranus-Pluto energies are so vibrantly activated.
Yeah.
Matt, do you have any? You've kind of interspersed your insights here and there, but are there any other things that you would like to say prior to our inviting others?
Well, I was thinking about what you were saying about how the way forward is more about finding a community rather than an individual hero who's going to do it for us. And there's another side to the way that astrology in our contemporary context is different from how it was practiced in the ancient world, where there was more of a deterministic flavor to the astrological worldview, where you would look at where the planets were at a given moment or at your own natal chart, and have a feeling that the stars were determining what your future held. Whereas what one of the gifts of the modern worldview is the sense of empowering the freedom of the individual to participate more fully in the realization of their own destiny. And that when you combine that modern Promethean sense of individuality and freedom with the archetypal astrological worldview, which kind of contextualizes and re-embeds the individual again in a universe of meaning, it elicits this more of a sense of relationship
Yeah.
and dialogue between the human being, the individual, and the wider universe. So
Yeah.
it seems like what we're searching for as we try to reintegrate this probably the most ancient form of science and interpretation of nature that human beings have.
Yeah.
As we attempt to reintegrate it, we're trying to balance that sense of embeddedness in a meaningful cosmos where the meaning is kind of given to us with this more modern sense of individual freedom
Yeah.
and our role as creative participants in that cosmological meaning.
Yeah, no, very well said. I mean, I think astrology, which has one form or another, seems to exist and have existed in most eras and cultures of humanity. It will express itself and take a form in each era and each culture that seems to very much come through the filter or the inflection of that era and that culture. And overall, if you look at the philosophies of the ancient Hellenistic world that were robust at the time that Western astrology was getting especially constellated, in Stoicism, for example, or in Epicureanism, or even in Platonism, there was less of a sense of agency. There was more of a sense of, the cosmic determinism of one form or another that was in the air. And I think people's lives were experienced that way generally too, That being said, I want to emphasize that as you go back in time, it's not just a kind of either fatalistic or deterministic astrology of the past and a liberated one coming in the 20th century with psychological astrology, et cetera. I mean, there is some truth to that, but it's more complicated because the ancients often had a sense of dialogue with the gods, like that there could be a certain, there could be entreaties, there could be prayers, there could be, you could play certain music, you could do different things that would invite or shift the energies at work, much as if you were in a relationship with another being, like a god or a powerful being or a pharaoh or, et cetera. So it's gone through lots of different stages, but you put your finger on it exactly. That I think we have a sense now for the way in which archetypes are not pre-given. Like astrology is not so much concretely predictive as it is archetypally predictive, and because archetypes are intrinsically multivalent and open to dynamic inflection or enactment in a large range of ways, that is what gives ontological space for human freedom. And not only space, but it requires our responsible response to these powerful energies. That's why Jung, who was deeply into astrology, as well as the depths of the psyche, they overlapped tremendously in his vision. And as he said, the discovery of the unconscious is a profound spiritual event that we have to integrate if we are to preserve our civilization, or I would say transform our civilization and preserve our Earth and species, so there's an obligation, in a sense, to come into a conscious relationship with the unconscious powers that are at work. And in that sense, archetypal astrology provides us with another step, which Jung basically had a strong sense for. It forwards the depth psychology project of making the unconscious conscious, but it does it in relationship to the cosmos and with a great, tremendously helpful specificity about the archetypal energies and complexes at work.
Great. So let's open it up for questions and comments. We've got a wireless microphone here that we'll pass around so everyone can hear you.
There's one right
so
there.
So, if I took my notes right, when Pluto and Saturn will be coming in early next year, you were thinking primarily financial and ecological, but I guess I'm curious also if Mars is involved here and what's the possibility of war or what's happening with Korea.
Yeah.
What do you foresee there? If, you
Yeah.
know, not being deterministic, but
Right.
yeah.
Well, yeah, they first come into orb early 2018. It gets much tighter in 2019, 2020. Pluto has an archetypal relationship to Mars. It's has sometimes been called the higher octave of Mars. It's like the more collective version of it. It would be similar to it's like if Mars is a fist fight, Pluto is an earthquake, and the fact of the matter is Saturn-Pluto alignments have coincided. Both world wars began under tight Saturn-Pluto aspects. The conjunction in 1914, the square in 1939, the Cold War, and the major crises of the Cold War on a roughly 7 year. It varies a little bit because of Pluto's erratic orbit, but the Saturn-Pluto quadrature alignments have coincided with the major crises of the Cold War, and then the last opposition we had was 9/11. So these are, there's, as I say, there's a gravity, a graveness to the climate of a Saturn-Pluto period, but it also tends to be a time where great moral courage can be brought to the fore, and you see in people who were born with Saturn-Pluto in major aspect often a capacity to really face the shadow of in some courageous way and bring a powerful response that forges a structure that endures after that in a very positive way. So I wanted to. We all knew, for example, those people who were studying astrology and tracking these things back in the 70s, we all knew that when the early 1980s, 81 to 84, there was going to be a Saturn-Pluto conjunction. That was the last time we had the conjunction, by the way. We had the opposition in 2001, 2004, 9/11, the first Bush administration, the first George W. Bush term. But the one in 1981 to 84 was the Reagan era. Margaret Thatcher in England. That was the height of the Cold War in many ways. Reagan was calling the Soviet Union, the evil empire. Those of you who were old enough at that time, and especially if you were politically engaged, will well remember the sense of the sword of Damocles of the nuclear crisis at that point. There was huge demonstrations against, because the Soviet Union, it was the last years before Gorbachev and Reagan, and the Republican political establishment in the United States were kind of mutually activating each other's tension and hostility. And there were a lot of op-ed articles at that point about the sense of the danger of having World War I, a replay of World War I. Everybody could see how there were so many missiles, nuclear missiles, that were poised in Europe that were aimed at the Soviet Union, and then the Soviet Union aimed at Europe and the United States. That one little mistake, which actually got pretty close at times, could have triggered a Holocaust, nuclear. And what happened was that historical awareness and that moral awareness and the sense of the great moral danger and responsibility surrounding nuclear power activated so many people and brought such a consciousness to the fore that there was a pulling back from the brink. And it's interesting that Nancy Reagan had an astrologer who you probably know about, who played a role. Her name was Joan Quigley, who, Nancy wanted her husband to be a successful president who was well remembered for his legacy, and she said, "Well, he's got to move towards peace, or else he's not going to be well remembered for his legacy." And anyway, the whole evolution of Reagan's relationship to Gorbachev and the kind of melting of boundaries there were a lot of factors that were going on behind the surface. I was living at Esalen at that point, and we had what was called Track 2 diplomacy going on, where members of the Kremlin and members of the State Department met at Esalen offline and related to each other as human beings. They did breath work with Stan Grof. They did hot baths together, where if you're naked in the hot tub, some of your armoring just shifts. And all these, and the people who were part of that wrote later that they felt this had an effect. I mean, what it did, it got avenues of trust moving into these highly polarized centers of power. Well, many people rose to the occasion in so many different ways during that period. Jonathan Schell's essays on the nuclear danger, a film called The Day After, I think it was just called The Day After, that showed what it would be like as a Holocaust. It was on television, seen by millions and millions. Anyway, people basically saw what the danger was, and from the top to the bottom, they moved back. And what I'm saying is that we are not predetermined puppets of these powerful forces, that there can be a consciousness that is brought to the drama that plays a role in shifting it. Now, it doesn't always make the difference. In 2000, under the last Saturn-Pluto opposition, what I was going to say is that, well, all those people in the 81 to 84 period who were not thinking astrologically, but they could see that the signs of a potential World War I were there. But the people who were astrologically informed knew that World War I had started under the exact same Saturn-Pluto conjunction cycle that we were again back to. So, and then the same thing in the opposition of 2001 to 2004. Now, most of us will remember how many we went out on the streets in 2002 and 2003, especially to try to stop both 2002 and 2003, to stop the Iraq invasion. And demonstration against war happened around the world. It was the largest day of, I think it was February 15th, I think, the largest day of anti-war demonstrations against an established government's desire to go to war that had ever been seen historically. And while Cheney brushed it off, it's just and we did go to war, and we are still suffering the consequences of that horrific decision. But something happened in the moral evolution of humanity in that period that didn't go away and is going to keep developing. And this is where the whole idea of the arc of the moral universe, it bends slowly towards justice. And this is the sentence that Martin Luther King often said, that Barack Obama often quoted, and it's originally from the 19th century transcendentalist Theodore Parker. And it's a deep vision that there is a moral evolution going on. It has ontological robustness. That's why he calls it the moral universe, the arc of the moral universe. It bends, and it bends slowly. I believe that that's happening, and so I believe that it can play a role in, yes, there's a real danger of war. There's no question about it. But and also of the financial of uglier sides of racism, and it tends to put up major security boundaries, and armoring, that type of thing is very typical, as happened. We're still living out the 9/11, post 9/11 security every time we go to the airport. So those are the types of things that tend to get constellated. But I want to emphasize how malleable, how multivalent and open to inflection by our creative and moral response.
There's okay, sure.
Mine should be, hello? So earlier you mentioned the conjunction and opposition of the full moon and the new moon, and it made me think of the eclipses, and I saw through Becca that you're going to be speaking about that in Oregon during the solar eclipse. So I'm curious, because it's also the time of year that's our hurricane season, and there's a lot of tsunamis and hurricanes, and we're kind of talking about the weather and the flooding and this kind of repetitive cycle. If you're concerned at all about any kind of major universal flooding or kind of the cleansing, right? Like the deluge kind of cleansing happening.
Yeah. Well, I don't have clairvoyant, gifts. I've got a pretty good intuition and kind of archetypal perception, which requires a sort of intuition, but it doesn't extend to concrete, images that some people can get very direct anticipations of events to come. I mean, I think we have enough data on the table to say that even if astrology were playing no role, the piper's going to be being paid for a while, and that extreme climate events are more likely to increase than otherwise. And so, yes, I think those are all possibilities. The eclipse, that's a whole nother thing, which Becca and I will speak at the Symbiosis Festival there in Oregon. The total solar eclipse is a kind of living, cosmic, numinous metaphor, an image of the conjunctio oppositorum of the solar and the lunar, which can also be seen as the coming together of, and the momentary eclipse of like solar consciousness, as it were, by the lunar whole, by the anima mundi, by the night sky, with its many stars and many gods and archetypal powers, and then the rebirth. It's a sacred marriage event. It has lots of, to me, it's more something of great symbolic and numinous power. I don't know. It could indeed play. I more see it as something that we can take, gain a sense of connection to the cosmos and to deep meanings, rather than it on its own being a trigger for great enormous collective events on the scale of the Uranus-Pluto square, for example, or even the Saturn-Pluto conjunction, as there are solar eclipses every year and lunar eclipses as well. But I do see it as a great event. But in terms of your other concerns, what's that?
Timing of it, like you even said kind of a keyword before, like the eye of the storm.
Yeah,
Think of that too, and
yeah,
it's
the hurricane season.
like the peak.
Yeah. Everything's possible. Give me shelter. That shelter that I had in mind was both, was both a recognition of the political and the ecological and the existential storms that we're going through. And it also was the idea that there is a shelter that is provided for the soul and by the nurturing dimension of the anima mundi, and this on a cosmic scale. And so that was also what I had in mind by Gimme Shelter too, like this other side of it.
Yeah, hi, Tori Biles here. Just wondering if you kind of pinging on what you said about a little bit about astrology moving forward the depth project, as well as the arc of justice comment moving towards more kind of a moral sense long term. I'm interested in this birth moment. If you could comment on what you think the shift in consciousness might be around, particularly intellectual and scientific intelligences, so to speak. If the scientific revolution, say, of the last 500 years, the Cartesian-Kantian split, you've written a lot about this emerging alternative epistemology of the participatory epistemology as opposed to the Cartesian split. And it's through that Cartesian split that we've had this disenchanted universe, this meaningless universe. But do you see this birth moment, and you and Stan Groff have talked about sort of this archetypal birthing to bring forth sort of the transcendence of a duality. Is what does that portend for kind of the scientific culture that we've been in of the last let's say 500 years or so? And is this the birth moment these next several years, or is it going to be much longer term, so to speak, till 2060? I don't know. What?
Yeah. It's very typical for people in times of, crisis to have a sense of the kind of cosmic imminence of rebirth, or of redemption, or of salvation. Looking back on the history of religion, for example, and how these will play out in the temporal sphere is a whole other issue. Kind of like archetypally, it's like right here, and we can often experience it vividly that way. But at the same time, it has often a much longer arc in history. On the other hand, there's an acceleration of history that is happens every Uranus-Pluto period, but in general, in our lifetime, the sense of history accelerating is just tremendous. I mean, and there are so many trends at work right now which are accelerating, environmentally, sources of energy, population growth, etc. I think in terms of the effect on the scientific culture, there are a lot of scientists who are pushing the edges of the old paradigm. We've had here speaking a number of times right in this very room, like Rupert Sheldrake, for example, who is just so articulate and I think lucid in so many ways as a spokesperson for a science that has kind of broken out of the Cartesian box. And, the Institute of Noetic Sciences is completely devoted to that project in many ways. And I think, I don't know, what's your sense, Matt, in terms of trends within the sciences that, show because you've written about this and thought about it a lot, the transcending of the Cartesian dualism, moving beyond the disenchanted worldview and so forth.
Yeah. I think in sort of the latter half of the 20th century, there was a recognition of complexity and the way in which the old sort of Cartesian, Newtonian view of the universe as a series of billiard balls interacting, obeying deterministic laws, and then if we only knew the state and the position and momentum of all of the billiard balls at any given moment, we could predict the entire future with enough time to calculate the mathematics of it. And then in the latter half of the 20th century, thinkers like Ilya Prigogine and others recognized that nature itself, it's not just a function of our limited knowledge, but that nature itself has this degree of depth and complexity to it and creativity that we can't actually predict everything that's going to happen, even if we had perfect knowledge. And, we've been doing a kind of archetypal weather report here, but anyone that tries to look at the weather reports that meteorologists give on a daily basis knows that it's as much an art as it is a science. There's no way to predict exactly what's going to happen in 2 days in terms of whether it's going to rain or not. There's a general sense that there's a front coming and it's probably going to rain, but maybe not. Things can shift. And that recognition that nature is a complex organic system, and that bringing the organic metaphor into physics, and that when we study processes of biological evolution and the profound historicity, the historical dimension of the biological world that made Darwin's vision of nature very different from Newton's vision of nature, where for Newton the physical universe wasn't a historically developing phenomenon. It was eternally fixed according to laws that God dictated 6,000 years ago. But now it seems that actually Darwin's vision that he thought only applied to the biological world actually applies to the physical world as well, that our entire universe is a historical process, and that atoms and stars and galaxies are just as much historically emergent sort of species of organism, actually, as are bacteria and plants and animals and so on. So it seems like the scientific vision of the universe is shifting into this more organic view. So that's one dimension of it, and another dimension of it is Also, sort of in the second half of the 20th century, I think, as what we call postmodernism began to come to the fore in universities and in the intellectual culture, there was this critique of science and this recognition of the way that science isn't just objective knowledge of nature. There's a political dimension, an economic dimension to the way that scientific knowledge is produced.
And gender as well.
And a gender dimension to it. And that all these cultural factors help to shape what we thought was an objective view of nature in itself. And it's at the point now where, something like half the country and the entire Republican Party thinks of climatologists as some kind of political lobby, and dismisses climate change as nothing but a plot that liberals are, trying to push on the American people to take over the world or something.
China's doing a hoax.
Or it's China's hoax. So there's this politicization of science that the right is attempting, but it's as if they've taken this postmodern insight, largely generated by leftist intellectuals, and thrown it back at us. So there's a sense in which we both need to defend the objectivity of science at the same time that we recognize the way that it's culturally constructed. And what gives science objectivity is the fact that climatologists have more instruments, satellites and thermometers, and they're measuring the planet. We have more technological instruments measuring the weather of this planet than ever before in history, and more every day. So who's better positioned to know what's going on with the climate than these very well-funded, expert, technologically outfitted scientists, or the Republicans in the Heritage Foundation, who are producing documentaries full of fake science. Clearly the people that have all the equipment and are doing the measurements and so on.
And also have a genuine aspiration to impartial knowledge,
Right.
which is a scientific ideal that is authentically present within the scientific mind and spirit.
Yeah.
Just as every person here has also, I think, authentic ideals that we are striving to live up to, but we also all can be influenced by unconscious biases, and we strive to be conscious of those biases so that we can live more ethically and more fully, and that's the same kind of, I think, balanced approach that I think we need to take to the sciences. Many scientists are really carrying a kind of prophetic role right now in relationship to the Earth community's reality.
Yeah.
Even though also lots of science in its disenchanted assumptions can increase the utilitarian objectification and exploitation of nature. So it's a
But that old Cartesian split between facts and values, the subjective and the objective, there was this huge march for science recently, and that same sort of rhetoric was coming back where, facts are on the side of liberals, right? And we're all about the facts and the science, and I think we need to avoid splitting facts and values in that way. Scientists have values. Science is political. Scientific knowledge has a political and a cultural dimension, and we should acknowledge that and say, this is what we value, and we value facts. And in order to seek out facts, you have to value the scientific method. So facts and values are completely mixed up together, and rather than pretend like we could isolate facts and values and isolate subjects and objects, we have to recognize the complexity and just, I think, be more upfront about it.
It just seems like we have a long way to go.
yeah. Then
Integrate the facts and the values.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You're always going to get this ideological or very relativistic position that's claiming itself to be just as valid as any other position, whether it's the Christian right or whatever, versus the scientific. But
Yeah.
it just seems like there's a long way to go
Yeah,
before you
a
participate.
long way to go, but we, just in terms of the Christian right, it's balanced by Laudato Si and Pope Francis's call for an integral ecology that it attends to ecological justice and social justice as part of one larger moral ideal. That's a pretty big thing. And by the way, just as we had Pope John the 23rd in the 1960s, who just opened up the Catholic Church to, ecumenical embrace. So Pope Francis represents another Uranus-Pluto kind of pope, opening up the church in as many ways as he's gone, not as many ways as we want him to, but he's playing quite a helpful counterbalance to the Christian right. And there are a lot of religion and ecology movements at work in the world today, which are we clearly need to have strong, because religion moves enormous numbers of people. Just a final response to your question about the sciences and the prospects for paradigm shift, as it were. Our own Brian Swim here at CIIS has really carried that re-enchantment of the sciences and of a cosmological vision as articulately as anybody. And he's carrying a lineage, Thomas Berry, Teilhard Chardin, Whitehead, that's a very noble one, and that I think is gaining strength. And you also have, just things like quantum physics. It puts undercuts a lot of the Cartesian assumptions. And while it didn't necessarily turn every quantum physics lab into a temple of spiritual transformation, it is acting at a deep level on the scientific imagination, and I think in the long run will bear more and more fruit in that way. David Bohm is another crucial figure in that development.
Thank you. I'm curious if what thoughts either of you have on the role and significance of the relatively new archetype of Eris in creating a culture of chaos that's still potentially generative.
Yeah, so, I'm hesitant at such an early date to feel secure in the identification of a very recently discovered planetary body with a particular archetype. It took the astrological community a long time to gradually get a clear grasp of what Uranus represented, and then Neptune, and then Pluto went faster. But in each case, there was a tremendous amount of symbolic, intuitive, empirical and work and dialogue that gradually brought forth what is now a virtually universal consensus among all practicing astrologers who know and follow the movements of the outer planets, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. There's universal consensus about their meanings, which says a lot. I mean, if you've ever been to an astrological conference, astrologers are a very intelligent and independent lot, but there's no way you could get everybody to agree about. I mean, talk about herding cats, and the fact that that everybody's basically seeing day after day the same archetypes at work with those particular planets represents an extraordinary consensus of that community worldwide. and we haven't gotten to that point with Eris yet. To it's really good that people like Kieran LeGrice, who came out of our got his doctorate here in PCC and is now at Pacifica as chair of the depth psychology department. He's written, a book about it, and I think it's really good that people are bringing that kind of attention to that issue. But I don't have yet a deep feeling for that yet, as an assured feeling. I'll just say one thing though, that Pluto also contains that idea of chaos and the regenerative possibility. Now, it could well be, I mean, Eris and Pluto, they're both, they're out in the Kuiper belt, and what's that? Yeah, exactly. And so there may be a kind of intra-familial resemblance or kinship amongst those. It's just too early to tell.
As you pointed out, most of the archetypes that have been discovered, the outer planet archetypes, are related to events in the world at the time of their
Yes.
discovery. Have you noticed anything related to that archetype that you would connect? From what comes to mind for me is just the widespread presence of terrorism. And if you just look at the role of Eris at the wedding that she wasn't invited to,
Yeah.
there's a certain kind of,
Yeah.
It's very suggestive. I'm certainly not
It
looking
is.
for definitive answers, but just generative first ideas about what that archetype could signify.
It's
Interested
hard
in
for
your
me
thoughts
to.
too, Matt.
Yeah, Matt, do you want to say anything?
I'm kind of an astrological, not novice, but I don't know that I have much of substance to add about Eris. Yeah.
I think if we look back, see, I mean, the point that you're making, when Uranus was discovered in 1781, if you look for a decade or so on each side of that discovery, it was clearly a time of, Prometheus Unbound. I mean, revolutions, French Revolution, the American Revolution, the beginning of the abolitionist movement, et cetera, just as well as cultural, technological, scientific breakthroughs and so forth. It was very Promethean period. And similarly with Neptune in the middle of the 19th century and Pluto in the 20th. And the history of terrorism tracks very closely with major Pluto alignments. Uranus-Pluto, the assassinations of the 60s, or of the reign of terror in the French Revolution was right during the Uranus opposite Pluto, and many of the current movements of terrorism are rooted in movements that began in the 1960s and early 70s under that Uranus-Pluto. And then typically under Saturn-Pluto hard aspects, such as took place at 9/11, you get a shorter period of when terrorist activity can come to the fore with a kind of highly planned destructive power. So there is a relationship already with terror and the Plutonic, and there's clearly a kind of arousal of, like as Stan Grof's work has shown, when people go through deep perinatal experiences, reliving their own birth, facing their own death, in their inner journeys, there's typically an activation of experiences, images, emotions, and elemental energies in the body and in the psyche that are very much like wars and nuclear explosions and terrorist eruptions and so forth. It seems to be, if we are as a collective undergoing a kind of collective perinatal death rebirth experience, the activation on a large scale of so many of the signs of what Stan Grof would call the third perinatal matrix, where you've got it's very plutonic energies, highly sexualized, the erotic, the unleashing of titanic technological forces that can also be very destructive, elemental energies, the hurricane, give me shelter, the storm is threatening. That kind of quality is so typical for that part of the perinatal journey that it kind of makes sense that humanity might have constellated through its interaction with the biosphere of the Earth a kind of perinatal crisis that one of its expressions is terrorism, and there's many other expressions as well. But from that point of view, I'm looking at it not simply in relationship to its connection to a particular celestial body, but to the larger process of a kind of spiritual unfolding and initiation of our species into a dying to its old identity and a birth into a new heaven and a new earth, to use the biblical phrase. And maybe on that hopeful note, we'll call it an evening. I'd like to thank everybody here for coming tonight, and
Yeah.
thank you, Matt,
Thanks,
so much.
everyone. Thanks, Rick.